Hello, and welcome once again to another episode of the TriDoc podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Sankoff, the TriDoc, an emergency physician and multiple Ironman finisher coming to you from beautiful, sunny Denver, Colorado. I had the distinct pleasure to be an invited guest on another podcast recently. Kevin Koskela is the host of the Tri-Swim Coach podcast, and on his program we discussed several topics, including 5 common myths in triathlon, or at least myths that I have come to see that many triathletes believe, based on questions that I frequently get. If you're a regular listener, none of these myths will come as a big surprise, as they tend to be regular themes in the segments that I cover on medical questions. In no particular order, I chose those 5 things as recovery aids actually help with recovery, I don't need a coach to train effectively for triathlon, product X will make me faster rather than just training more, I'm past my prime, I'm only going to get slower, and finally, quantity of training is more important than quality of training. Now, I went into a lot of detail on each of these on Kevin's show, and I would encourage you to give it a listen. Kevin is going to join me on an upcoming episode of this podcast as well, to give some insight on how adult-onset swimmers can make the most of their time in the pool and dispel the notion that only high school and college competitive swimmers have a chance on race day. I'll post a link to the Tri-Swim Coach podcast in the show notes, and I urge you to give it a listen. It's a good one. On the show today, I continue my exploration of the issues and controversies raised by the Netflix documentary The Game Changers. It's getting late, and I'm getting into the twilight of this series with only a few interviews left to broadcast. On today's show, Chris Leiferman is a professional triathlete with much success at the Ironman distance. Chris has 3 Ironman victories to his name, and a top 10 finish in his Kona debut this past October. Chris also is a meat eater, and he's going to talk about how he incorporates animal products into his diet and still is able to have athletic success. Reels for Wheels has 2 new suggestions for you for movies to watch on the trainer, and they're quite different from the last episode. This time around, one is a British heist film, while the other is a sports comedy in the vein of Slapshot, and we have reviews of both. First, though, I have a medical question to answer. A listener wrote to ask about whether or not he should consider the expense of a TENS device. These transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation machines are marketed as having the capability to enhance strength, recovery, and improve the healing of injuries. Given how much they cost, one would hope that they could actually do all of these things. But what does the evidence say? Well, I take a look right after this. If you've listened to this podcast on any kind of a regular basis, then you know that I have covered a variety of different devices that manufacturers claim help with recovery. Some of these have been high-tech, some of them a little bit lower-tech. But to date, none of the ones that I have recovered have really lived up to the hype that the manufacturers have claimed, and so far, you're pretty much better off keeping the money in your pocket. Well, today I'm going to answer a question that was submitted by Trey. Trey wants to know whether or not it'd be worth his time or his money to invest in a TENS device. TENS, and its cousin acronym NMES, leverage a type of technology known as electrical muscle stimulation, or EMS. Now, TENS devices, or transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulators, and NMES, or neuromuscular electrical stimulators, both use low levels of current to stimulate different levels of nerves within the skin or the muscles in order to arrive at different kinds of results in order to enhance recovery, or so their makers claim. When attached to the skin, a typical EMS unit will deliver an electrical impulse to the body's motor nerves, or, in the case of a TENS device, sensory nerves, that will cause rapid muscle contractions. And that gives you all kinds of twitches and spasms that you'll see in the device's videos that will show up on their websites. Now, makers of these devices claim that the contractions can help speed up recovery time, relieve pain, increase muscle strength, and even improve performance. And the 2 devices, the NEMS and the TENS, are marketed for different types of things. So the NEMS are the neuromuscular electrical stimulation is marketed principally for improving strength and for recovery, while the TENS devices are really primarily for pain relief and for maybe a little bit of increasing recovery as well. Now, these devices are expensive. They're about $200 at the lower sort of entry level, all the way up to $600, depending on what kind of currents you want to get, what kind of modes they want to offer, and really, honestly, they all do pretty much the same thing, but they can be dressed up to give you different types of bells and whistles, if you will. And many of them are endorsed by professionals in different kinds of sports, and as always, looking at these websites, you would think they are the end-all to be-all. Now, the theories behind these devices are, fairly sound. The theory is that muscle contraction, as we've seen with some of the compression wear and pneumatic compression boots, muscle contraction, the idea is, can compress the muscle cells and the surrounding tissues as well, and this results in extruding fluid and getting rid of some of the inflammatory chemicals that come about whenever you do hard level exercise, and by getting rid of these things, you're going to reduce the amount of swelling and reduce the amount of soreness that comes about. EMS is also theorized to help improve strength because when you provide an electrical current to the muscles, especially with the NMES, the neuromuscular electrical stimulation, the deeper current, if you will, what happens there is you're able to recruit larger numbers of muscle units than otherwise would be possible. So when you voluntarily contract a muscle, you recruit a whole bunch of muscle units, but when you send an electrical current, you recruit even more. And so the idea is that by recruiting these larger numbers of muscle cells, you're going to actually get increased strength than otherwise would be possible. Finally, with respect to this notion that you can reduce pain, TENS, or the transcutaneous electrical stimulators, are theorized to inhibit pain receptors. What they do here is they provide a competing stimulus in the painful area that basically distracts your brain and causes the nervous system to pay attention to the signal that the TENS unit is sending and diverts your brain from focusing on the painful stimulus. The basic theory behind this is known as the pain gate theory. Your pain receptors open up a gated channel. Using this TENS device will actually cause a different channel to open and shut down the gate for the pain stimulus, and therefore you'll no longer feel the pain to the same degree. So that's the theory. Let's look at some of the evidence. There are many studies that have come out on this, and I found several review studies, all of which will be listed as always in the show notes. Let's look at each of these claims in turn and see what the evidence has to say. With respect to the idea that neuromuscular electrical stimulation can enhance strength, there's actually quite a bit of research looking at these devices, specifically in medical illness. And in cases where patients have suffered spinal cord injury, patients who have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is known to result in significant muscle wasting, patients who are spending long times in intensive care units and have muscle wasting related to that, and for patients who have had significant surgical procedures, even those who have had orthopedic procedures on knees, for example, knee replacements or even ACL repairs. Neuromuscular stimulation does actually appear to have benefits in these patients. The reason for this is because these patients have such profound muscle wasting that applying an electrical current here will indeed recruit muscle units that otherwise aren't going to get used at all. And using neuromuscular stimulation in these patients does actually result in a decrease in muscle wasting and can improve strength that otherwise is not able to be seen. Now, what about for healthy individuals, patients who don't, for example, lie in bed all day because they're critically ill? And specifically, what about athletes? Well, in all of the studies that have been done looking at neuromuscular stimulation, electrical stimulation in these kinds of people, neuromuscular electrical stimulation is found to be better than nothing, but is not better than resistance training. That is to say, if you sit there and you put these units on your legs and you go through a whole bunch of contractions several times a day over several weeks, yeah, you're going to see some improvement in strength versus not doing anything at all. But if you use an actual weight training program, you're going to get significantly stronger than using the device on its own. Well, what about using the devices in conjunction with resistance training? Well, in those cases, neuromuscular electrical stimulation has in fact not been shown to be any better than just using resistance training. So the answer here seems pretty clear that use of these devices does not actually improve strength if you're doing any kind of weight training at a baseline. So doing weight training, basically better than using these devices. Okay, how about muscle fatigability? There's been some claims by the makers of these devices that the use of neuromuscular electrical stimulation can actually promote endurance and prevent some kind of muscle fatigue. Well, various studies have looked at these devices and their ability to delay the onset of fatigue, but these studies have, for the most part, focused on individual muscle groups, and the findings there have been pretty inconsistent. Some have actually shown promise, where others have shown no difference. But it's not really clear how to extrapolate the findings from small muscle groups to overall endurance. For example, some of the studies have looked at the use of neuromuscular devices, neuromuscular electrical stimulating devices, just on the abdominal wall. And it turns out that when you use these devices on the abdominal wall repeatedly, you'll actually find that the abdominal musculature will indeed show some benefits. There will be a increased time of duration until that specific muscle group will fatigue. But how does this correlate to overall body endurance? Nobody seems to know how to extrapolate that finding to endurance. So, using this device on your abdominal muscle, is that going to make you able to run, longer with improved speed? Unclear. I'm not really sure how to, extrapolate that and give you a good answer. But I would say, sure, if you want to have one specific muscle improve with its fatigability, there is some evidence that this might help. But again, not really clear how to turn that into performance. The big one and the big area that these devices have been promoted is in recovery. And there are several aspects to recovery that have been evaluated in the medical literature on this. First and foremost, there's recovery of performance. So in other words, you've done a high intensity event or a high intensity session of training, and using these devices, is it going to get you back to the level that you can repeat the same level of intensity effort sooner than if you don't use this device? Well, several studies have been done to look at exactly this question. And use of the neuromuscular electrical stimulating device specifically, not TENS, but the actual NMES ones, does indeed show that you can improve blood flow and metabolite removal when you use these devices. So if you check blood samples from an area, say the leg or the arm, where you've had a really high-intensity event or a high-intensity training session, you will see that blood flow improves and lactate levels actually are decreased after using these devices. Great. But what does that mean in terms of the ability to return to the same level of performance? Unfortunately, no improvement in performance when compared to controls has ever been seen with these devices. And this goes across running, jumping, cycling, any events that have been looked at. Neuromuscular electrical stimulation, while it does seem to improve blood flow and the removal of metabolites, it doesn't result in the improvement in performance. A second area of recovery that's been looked at pretty extensively is muscle soreness and delayed onset muscle soreness. As any triathlete knows, these are major inhibitors in the ability to return to high-level training. If you've had a pretty hard activity, you can have significant muscle soreness afterwards, and it may take a couple of days before you can get back to doing another hard activity. So the makers of these devices have suggested, well, hey, if you use our device, we can decrease your muscle soreness and get you back to a high level of activity sooner. Well, there's been mixed results using these devices. Some studies have suggested that there are improvements in pain scores for delayed onset muscle soreness, but this has not been associated with any improvement in performance. In other words, while people in these studies will say, yeah, you know what, it doesn't seem to hurt quite as much, when they actually look at objective markers of performance, they don't do any better than if they didn't use these devices. Now, with uses of the transcutaneous devices, the TENS devices, you could see some transient improvements in pain relief, but again, no improvement after a short time and no improvement in performance when you use these devices compared to not using them. And the final area in which these devices have been looked at and in which the makers claim, that they're useful is for injury recovery. And there have been studies to look at electromuscular stimulation to decrease swelling, pain, and improve function after sprains. The idea here is that by causing the muscles in the area of an injury to contract, you're going to increase blood flow to that area and remove some of the edema or swelling that results from the injury. And here, once again, studies have consistently shown that there's simply no improvement over controls or standard therapy such as ice, compression, and raising the injured area. Other studies have shown some improvements in the swelling and pain, but again, no change in time to return to function and no change in overall return to performance in any objective markers. So I think the take-home message for TENS devices and neuromuscular electrical stimulation devices is going to be the same as several of the other devices that we've looked at, where manufacturers' claims about improving recovery are just not backed up by the evidence in the medical literature. And once again, I did a pretty comprehensive review, and all of the recent studies on this are pretty consistent. When it comes to improving recovery, you're probably best off keeping your money in your pocket, not investing a whole lot into these devices, and just doing the things that really are shown to help with recovery. And that is rest, good nutrition, and just building your training program to incorporate good amounts of recovery into your day. Do you have a question for me to consider answering on the podcast? Well, send it to me at tri_doc@icloud.com. For my regular interview segment of the podcast, I'm going to continue with my series, taking a deeper dive into some of the questions raised by the Netflix documentary, The Game Changers. If you haven't seen the film or heard the first interviews in this series, I would urge you to do so, though it isn't necessary before listening to this one, as each of them can stand on their own. Chris Leiferman is a professional triathlete from southern Minnesota who now lives and trains in Boulder, Colorado. Chris grew up playing sports, but primarily was involved in wrestling, baseball, and football. He moved to Fort Collins, Colorado for college and realized how big triathlon is and began to pursue it further. He met his wife Xana through college and in time moved down to Boulder to live with her, where she is now in real estate. Chris is a 3-time Ironman champion and placed 10th in his debut at the 2019 Kona World Championships. He is in his third year on the BMC VFit Tri-Team powered by UPlace. But today he is joining me on the TriDoc podcast to talk about the Game Changers. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
In your view, you've seen the film. What do you think the Game Changers gets right, and what does it get wrong about plant-based and animal-based nutrition?
They get wrong thinking that you absolutely have to be vegan or else you're not going to be able to perform. They make it sound very one-sided, and it's not necessarily vegetarian. Like it's going full on vegan, and they do get right about the environmental impact about it. I think towards the end of the movie, they do touch on that, and that has a big impact on, the world today. And plant-based, they also talk about the recovery of being plant-based. And I think that has a good aspect of it, but I feel they didn't interview high caliber meat eating athletes. Like they only interviewed 3 or 4 vegan athletes that were really good at their sport, but there's also really good people that eat meat, and just completely left that out of there. And I thought that they could have had a few opposing views.
Yeah, and that's come up in all of the interviews that I've had in the series so far, is that the filmmakers took a very one-sided view and were very biased. And I mean, it's their movie. They obviously had a message they wanted to put forward, and that was their prerogative. But I think it would have served their the point they wanted to make would have been no less served if they had presented both sides with maybe a little more balance. So I completely agree with you. And that's something that I've tried to do in this series, is to try and get a little more balance. So you yourself do consume meat products and animal products as part of your regular nutrition. Looking at the film, I mean, you would think that a single meat-based meal is enough to make you sluggish and unable to perform. Has that ever been your experience?
No, it hasn't. And I think what they think about meat eaters, or we're trying to portray about meat eaters, is that 90% of a meat eater's plate is straight meat, and that 10% is grains and vegetables. I think the majority of athletes that eat meat really have a well-proportioned diet. They get some protein from their meat, but it's a high vegetable diet as well. It's just that they're eating meat in conjunction with that. So it's, you still get a lot of the benefits from the vegetables.
Yeah. I mean, there's no question North American diet, especially in certain parts of the United States where fried foods, where we see a lot of consumption of high fat in conjunction with meat. So if you want to think about fried chicken, or if you want to think about barbecue that has a lot of fat with the meat,
sure. Yep.
You're going to see a lot of obesity there. You're going to see not so much vegetables, but rather things like French fries or mashed potatoes or things that we wouldn't consider really healthy vegetables. Then yes, if you want to focus on that, then you're going to see what you're going to see in the segment of the movie where they went to the fire department. I mean, these clearly were not people eating the balanced kind of meal that you're talking about. But, as I've said frequently in this series, if you approach diet as a balance, like you're referring to, then incorporating meat products, if that's your prerogative, then it can be done in a very healthy way, and in a way that is going to result in a very nutrition balanced and very healthy way that's going to allow you to perform at the highest level, as you have found. How do you incorporate meat products to try and make sure that, it's healthy, so that you're not finding that you have too much fat there? Because we know that meat products are a source of fat. So how do you make sure that you're conscious of that when you're incorporating meat products?
Yeah, well, first off, my wife and I, we're kind of environmental conscious when it comes to that. And we've done this twice now, a quarter cow from a local farmer. So it's a grass-fed organic beef, and it's from out here in Fort Lupton, so just outside of Boulder, and it's sustainably sourced, and that helps us feel better about our impact on that's the red meat we use. We raise chicken, so we are having farm fresh eggs. We did end up having to buy our chicken from the store. So when we do that, we're conscious about the type of chicken that we're buying. But we also just have lean meats. The portion size is controlled. We're not filling up on meat. 50% is vegetables of our plate, then 25% grains, and maybe 25% with that meat. And that seems to have a really good impact, that we're not just pumping down meat, and we are getting a lot of a well-rounded diet that way.
And you mentioned to me before we started recording that you also eat meat less. So you tend to eat meat maybe 50% of your meals, and the rest of your meals are actually plant-based. And that's another means that you can control the amount of meat products and the amount of fat that you're maybe taking in.
Yeah. No, I've actually felt really good that way. And it's actually really easy. It has broadened our horizons for cooking. We also, we go out to eat maybe once a week. So we do all of our cooking at home, and that's really nice. And it just allows us to have more control that way. Yep.
When you do get your meat products? We've seen in the past, especially in professional cycling, where doping is a significant problem. Often you'll hear of cyclists say, "Oh, I got this from tainted meat products," things like that. I know it's completely absurd, but is this ever something you need to worry about? I mean, I guess if you're sourcing your meat directly from a farm, but when you're going out to eat or anything like that, is this something that ever even crosses your mind?
It actually hasn't, because I think it's super made up by anyone who says that they got tainted by meat. And I think living here in Boulder, I shouldn't say this across the board for all restaurants, but if we do tend to go out, I guess I have a trust in those restaurants. I think we're a little special here. We don't do, chain restaurants, mostly local good eateries here. And again, getting locally sourced beef really helps out with that too. But no, it has never crossed my mind. It's actually never been a conversation of any of my buddies either that's a worry. So anyone who says that they got tainted meat is obviously lying.
Yeah, well, I keep waiting for the first vegan athlete to get popped and say something like it tainted tofu, but
it tainted chickpeas.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so going back to the film, The Game Changers, you mentioned something to me a little earlier that was also raised in the film about how one of the things that keeps you from going plant-based completely is that you worry about missing something in your diet. So what would be something like that you would worry about?
Well, the two obvious things that I think are drilled into people who are thinking of going vegan or vegetarian are the B12 and folate, but with a supplement and eating dairy, and eggs, it doesn't necessarily be a problem. I've talked to my coach and also sports nutritionist Katie Kassane about this, and neither of them were like, whoa, okay, I don't know about going vegetarian or limiting your meat impact and being a professional triathlete. Like, it wasn't even a thought. Like, they just continued on with our conversation as if it is a good thing to go plant-based or to minimize your meat input. So it's
so you mean it's taking hold in the coaching and nutrition sort of ranks amongst professional triathletes that it's almost an accepted way to go at this point.
It's accepted. Yeah. Going vegan, I think, is a whole nother level, but as long as you're octolavo, you're definitely catching all of those nutrients. So I'm really not too worried about it, but the two obvious ones would have been B12 and folate, but doesn't really concern me too much anymore.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned that you would have liked to have seen them interview some meat eaters in the film, that would have helped balance things out. Is there anything else you would have liked to have seen in the film that would have made it a little sort of easier to swallow?
I think that blood sampling, when they're like, here's your blood on meat, here's your blood on vegan. But what's that mean? They just go, this is clear, this is not clear. What if not clear was good? They just gave us like a visual aspect of it. And then we're like, oh, unclear is bad. Clear is good. But in reality, it's like, what does that mean?
I'm really happy to hear you mention that, because I've chatted about that with a couple of the other guests who have science backgrounds, and we both sort of commented that, to us, that really was not fair because they didn't explain it very well. But I had always sort of thought in the back of my mind that to a layperson without the good training, that was like one of those visual tricks that they could use to kind of pull one over on people. And I'm really happy to hear you say that, no, actually, they didn't pull one over on me at all, that without context and without explaining that really doesn't mean anything. Because they did that a lot in the film. They used a lot of visual imagery, a lot of graphs, a lot of animations and stuff that were not contextualized very well. And because of that, were quite misleading.
Yeah, I thought there could be a little more explanation on that. I know they had to fill a lot of content in a short amount of time, but yeah, they could have gone in depth on that. And they just kind of seemed limited. They had a track cyclist. They had a 60-year-old, guy who was ripped as being a vegan. Who else did they have? Oh, they had Nate Diaz as a UFC fighter. It just seemed like they had three or four athletes, and there's so many good meat eaters out there. It's like in other sports that have Olympic gold medals and world championships, and it's not just one-sided.
Yeah.
And they could have, and I know that would have probably deflated their point, so they didn't do it.
Yeah. So let's go the other way then, and let's talk about some of the other things that you've encountered along your journey to becoming an elite level triathlete. I'm sure you've encountered many of these fad diets, paleo or keto or any of those other things. What's been your approach to, when those things are presented?
I just kind of get a little annoyed by the people that are presenting them to me because it's a lifestyle change. This isn't a fad. Like, if you're going to go on a diet, if you're going to pursue something, you have to look at it as a lifestyle change and not just a diet. And I see so many people cheat on diets. And my aunt, she's keto, but she drinks beer all the time. And I'm just like, what's going on here? Like, it just seems, and then she pushes keto. She's 100% into keto. And
except when she has a beer.
Except when she's drinking, and that happens quite often. So it's just weird, and I think that you have to really think about these diets as a lifestyle change. And paleo is just really hard because our day society, we like to go out and eat, and that really restricts almost any time you go out to eat. Gluten-free is easier nowadays, especially where I live. Dairy-free is pretty easy as well, but it's just really hard hearing some of these people push it and really don't have anything to back it up.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that. So I got one more thing to ask you, and it's a little bit off of the topic we've been talking about. I know as a professional triathlete, you guys are, it's tough to make a living. I mean, let's face it, purses are small. You don't have a ton of endorsement opportunities, and that sometimes puts you in a tough place because you'll be approached by people who maybe want you to endorse a product that you may or may not believe in. And so you're faced with, let's see, I've got this person wanting to give me some money to push a product that, well, maybe I don't necessarily 100% believe in. So what's the calculus that goes into that? Because I know I've seen, I could give you some examples of like athletes, professional triathletes that I sort of see pushing products that I'm like, oh my God, really? Like, I sort of like, I lose respect for them. But at the same time, I understand, that they have to make a living. So what's that like for you guys? I'm not a used car salesman, so it's really hard for me to do that. And I actually lose respect for myself when I do that. I think I have fallen victim to that a couple of years ago, and I did not like it. But when the money's green, it's, right. You kind of want to take advantage of it. But I think I'm in a fortunate position right now with my team that I can pick and choose. We're sponsored by a bunch of good companies, and I'm happy to promote all of them. But I do see that, and like I tend to lose respect for some people who are pushing these weird oxygen mouth guard things, or maybe they do work, but I just think it's all really niche-y, and people trying to get into the market, and they find a professional triathlete or runner or something, then someone willing to push it. But no, for me, it's like I kind of lose respect for myself doing that, and it's hard. It's tough. I feel bad because, like I said, I feel like they're in a really tough spot. But at the same time, I'm like, gosh, you're using your name and your reputation, and then there's a bunch of triathletes out there who are looking at you and are going to go out and spend money that they don't have necessarily a lot of either, and on a product that maybe products that I have reviewed on this podcast. And so that's why I sometimes sort of find myself wondering, but at the same time, I completely understand. I mean, I look at, you and your colleagues, and I so envy what you're able to do, but I do not envy the fact that it is a job, and that if you're not winning, you're not necessarily getting an income. So I totally understand. It's a difficult position.
Yeah. And I think with today's the way social media is going, like everything, it's almost not even winning anymore. Like you can sustain yourself just by social media. So and pushing products that you may not believe in, a lot of people tend to do it. I think that's probably my career goal, is to never fall victim to that. Once it comes to that, I think it's done. I think it's time for me to move on, because I can't sell something that I don't believe in.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. Chris Leiferman is a professional triathlete who lives in Boulder, Colorado. He is a 3-time Ironman champion, and in his debut at Kona this year, finished 10th. What was that like?
That was pretty cool. I did not know what to expect. I just went and raced a conservative race because I know, just so many people blow up. It's hot, it's competitive, everyone's wanting to win, and I had zero expectations for me. I was an underdog. People didn't expect me to win, so I was there to go and feel out the race and just go have a good experience and learn from it. I hope next year and the years to come, I can keep stepping forward. And I think 10th place for my first time was pretty rad. So I'll take it.
I'll agree. My first time there, I did not finish 10th, but congratulations. And thank you again so much for joining me today to talk about your diet and your feelings and opinions about the Netflix documentary, The Game Changers.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
It's time again for Reels for Wheels, that part of the program when I'm joined by my friend and colleague Janetta Iwaniki, multiple Ironman finisher, to give you some suggestions for films to watch while you're whiling away time on the trainer. January is just about done, so we can start to look forward to the longer days, some warmth, and maybe getting outside, but for now, we're still going to be spending some time in the pain cave. And so I'd like to welcome Janetta back once again to discuss and recommend some movie suggestions for you while you're toiling away. Welcome back, Janetta.
Thanks. Glad to be back. We actually had a little bit of snow last night, so it's perfect timing to be back in the cave again.
I know. I got up this morning and I found the snow out there, and I was like, "When did this happen?"
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful that we'll see some warm. It's going to be very warm this coming weekend here in Denver. We're looking at 70 degrees, which is going to be very nice. But winter's not done, and so definitely trainer time is going to continue. So what have you got for us this time?
So today we have one of my favorite underdog sports movies called Goon, Goon, just because it's not a word that we often use unless you're really into hockey and people who fight a lot on the ice. And it's a movie that was just so much better than I ever thought it could be. I stumbled onto it almost by accident, looking through just potential sports underdog films, and I have watched it many times since then.
Yeah, and you mentioned it to me that you were going to be talking about it. I took a look on IMDb, watched the trailer, and I have to say, as a longtime hockey fan, and I mentioned to you before we started recording, anytime a movie is going to promote the idea that hockey is about fighting, I always get a little bit squirrely, but as was the case for the movie Slapshot, which really kind of, went to great lengths to show that hockey was really much more than that. I understand Goon does the same.
Absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, the trailer doesn't necessarily bring that through. But really, at its heart, what it is the story of someone who feels a bit out of place in the world. He comes from a family of all doctors who are very academic people. And really, that's not his thing, and has a hard time sort of figuring out what he's good at in life. And happens to discover that one of the things he's really good at is protecting people he cares about. And it turns out that translates really well to becoming a hockey enforcer, or goon, as they like to call him in the movie.
Yeah, and I was impressed with the fact that it's a Canadian film, being from Canada myself.
Yes.
I recognized many of the major players, really the actors that you probably wouldn't recognize if you aren't familiar with the liturgy of Canadian TV and film. But there are some folks there that people would know. Eugene Levy has a role in here.
Yep.
And for hockey fans, I did see in the trailer that Georges Laraque actually was there. And I'm sure there are other hockey players that I didn't see.
Yeah.
But I was quite impressed with one of the main protagonists in the film being played by Liev Schreiber.
Yeah, and he is actually fantastic. I mean, talk about an actor you wouldn't necessarily expect to show up in a small Canadian indie film about a small, tiny hockey team. But he is fantastic in the role. He really brings a lot of intensity to it, and a lot, too, I think, of understanding how somebody totally embraces that role. He plays so Sean William Scott plays the primary character and really the lead role of this guy who's new to minor league hockey. And Liev Schreiber plays sort of his counterpart, who's older, wiser, and really his both his nemesis and sort of his inspiration in a lot of this. And it's a very interesting relationship, too. So it gives you a lot of insight into what that world is like.
So you're the new me, eh? I don't know about that. I don't think so. Everyone else seems to. It's good. Good for you, kid.
Thank you.
So what are you doing wandering around St. John's at 3 o'clock in the morning? Aren't you guys playing us tonight?
Yeah, but not me. I got suspended a game.
Too bad. I ain't much for waiting around. You're a tough little bastard out there. You can fucking bang.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
So I'm gonna impart some of the wisdom of my years on you.
And I could really use some of that.
Everybody loves their soldiers until they come home and stop fighting. You understand what I'm saying?
I don't know. No.
Kid, you got this thing. The stuff, the shit, the fucking grit. You got it, like me. But like me, that's all you fucking got. And like me, you're no good to anyone doing anything else. All I'm saying is don't go trying to be a hockey player. You get your fucking heart ripped out.
And one of the things that I took from the trailer that I know is very much true in hockey was the mutual respect that the respective fighters on each team had for each other. Fighting in hockey is definitely, it's much less of a part of hockey than it used to be. When I was growing up watching hockey, fighting was really a much bigger part of it, but it's become less so. But what remains, these guys who have this role on their teams really have a very great respect for each other. They see each other as part of a league, if you will, within a league. And, what you could see in the trailer where Liev Schreiber's character actually has coffee with the protagonist in this film, and they're discussing, look, if it comes down to it, we're going to go, and it's going to be me against you, and it's going to be, for
I'm
real.
Win, yeah.
Yeah. And even with Georges Laraque, same thing, where they're lining up for a face-off, and George says, hey, you want to go? Is this a good time? And, the other guys, absolutely, let's do it. And according to a lot of interviews I've heard with these kinds of players, that does happen. That is very true to life.
And there are those moments of not just respect, but almost acknowledgement they actually do a great job of capturing right before the gloves come off. That those moments of connection that are really intense.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think that's one of the things I really liked about the film. And from that idea of respect as well, the other thing that I really liked was that it made it really clear that, Doug the Thug, his role is not, he doesn't see it to go out there and hurt somebody else or cause harm. He sees it, he's protecting his teammate. Right. And that's very much how he views his role and his job, and he's absolutely invested in that. And so for him, his fighting is really a big representation of how important his team is to him. And that's something that I found oddly touching and really pretty insightful in this movie.
And you mentioned to me that this is based on true events?
It is, yeah. So it's based on a memoir of a guy who actually became a minor league hockey enforcer from really out of nowhere and couldn't skate when he started, just like this guy.
Wow.
So really just happened to be somebody who found their calling.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. I'm going to give it a watch because your recommendations are always excellent. Although recently we may have had a disagreement on one of them, but that's okay.
Fair enough.
But this one I'm definitely going to give a watch because I can see it's coming from people who respect the game and aren't exploiting the fighting in the way that I had feared initially.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it gives a lot more depth and a lot of respect to sort of that team dynamic.
Yeah.
And one thing that I love about it as something to watch on the trainer is I've always been a hockey fan, but I think by having the fights be an important component, but not necessarily the entire focus, it gives you these episodic bouts of action that I don't always expect from watching even a sports movie or an underdog film. So It's got that nice sort of balance there.
What kind of trainer rides do you think are suitable for this film?
I like it for short intervals, actually.
Okay.
And it sort of lines up nicely with the action components. The comedy keeps you entertained in between. Fair warning, though, if you've got young kids around, there are a lot of expletives in this film, and so you may want to decide how you want to manage your volume if you've got kids in the house.
Okay, great. Well, for my recommendation this time, the film that I am going to suggest is Layer Cake. Now, Layer Cake is very much in keeping with films that we have talked about in the past because it's got tons of connections to many of the films that we have reviewed before. So it's directed by Matthew Vaughn, who directed Kick-Ass and Kingsman, both films we've talked about, and it stars Daniel Craig and Tom Hardy, both of whom have been in many of the films we've reviewed before. Sienna Miller is also in this. This is not, however, in line with the idea that movies should be easy to follow. This is a story that's a little bit convoluted and definitely requires your attention in some ways. Daniel Craig plays a respected cocaine dealer. He wants to get out of the crime scene. He's trying to get out early, but he's forced by his boss to undertake one last job. So this is one of those, one last job movies. And unfortunately, this turns out to be incredibly complicated and convoluted. It involves bumbling crooks, a murderous Serbian gang, 2 million pounds worth of pounds in terms of currency as opposed to weight of ecstasy, as well as a whole series of double crossing. And the title Layer Cake refers not so much to the layers of complications, but rather to the layers or levels anyone in business goes through in rising to the top. And what's revealed is really a modern underworld where the rules have changed, there's no codes or families anymore, and respect really lasts only as long as a line. Not knowing who he can trust, he has to use all of his savvy, telling, and skills, which make him one of the best in order to escape and become the cream of the crust and get himself to the top of the cake. And I really enjoyed this film. I found it to be completely unexpected at every turn. It's very much in the same vein as movies like Snatch or the other films that Guy Pearce has done. It's just it's a fun, rollicking sort of movie with a lot of great actors in it that do a great job of making a fun story already to be even that much more enjoyable.
When I was born, the world was a far simpler place. It was all just cops and robbers. But it wasn't for me. Then came the summer of love. Hashish and LSD arrived on the scene. There were villains locked away for 12 years for robbing a bank of 10 grand, doing time with drippy hippies who were doing 12 months for smuggling 2 million quid's worth of puff. I mean, work it out, mate. We're in the wrong fucking game. Drugs changed everything.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, the first time I watched it, I'm not sure I totally got the entire story of what was going on, but I enjoyed it regardless. But it's interesting, though. The reason I watched it the first time was they just announced Daniel Craig as the next James Bond. And I looked at a picture of him and I was like, there's no way this guy could play anybody like that. So then I went and watched Layer Cake and I was like, all right, he's got some action chops. This actually could work out pretty well. And especially with the turn that they took in the new James Bond films towards being a bit grittier, more of a street fighter, it really was a very natural fit. And I think Layer Cake, for me, at least mentally, really set that up in a way that I could appreciate it.
I agree. I think this was the most natural sort of transition for him as an actor. For, going from this movie to James Bond makes a lot of sense. If you haven't seen this movie yet, seeing the James Bond movies and then seeing this movie, you could see the transition very easily.
I can see how they came to where he just embodies that role as it's defined now.
Yeah, because we've seen him now in a lot of other movies. A recent film that's come out, the Knives Out. Knives Out, which
I haven't seen it yet.
I know Ryan Johnson, one of my favorite directors, and it's got a phenomenal cast. But
we'll
again,
have to add
Daniel
this to
Craig,
a future podcast.
exactly. But Daniel Craig, once again, showing his range of being able to play such very different type of characters. Really has had those opportunities because of what he did in the Bond films, and this Layer Cake was sort of the closest to anything he's done in James Bond, and I've seen since then he's done just wildly disparate things. So it's been kind of fun to see his evolution as an actor.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, but in terms of the director Matthew Vaughn, this is like right in keeping with his other films. It's very quick paced, lots of very fast edits, and it keeps you very entertained. Definitely, you're going to want to watch this movie with headphones because you really do have to pay attention to the story. So it's not the kind of thing where you're going to be doing really high intensity intervals, because if you lose track, you're going to lose track of the movie. So, a longer sort of moderate to lower intensity workout, this is the perfect film. I really enjoyed it and found that the movie really was fast paced and kept me motivated.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. It's one that I've come back to a couple of times, especially for intense, longer work. I find it really enjoyable. Do you have particular other types of things that you like to be sure you're doing during those workouts, or just long intervals?
Yeah, I think longer steady state type stuff, or it's fine if you've got some shorter, real VO2 type things. That's fine, but nothing that's gonna divert you from
too much from paying attention.
Exactly. You got it, because the story is pretty intricate, and this is one of those where you have to be able to pay attention.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah,
I agree.
All right. Well, that ends this particular episode of Reels for Wheels. As always, I will update the archives that can be found on both the TriDoc podcast and the TriDoc coaching websites, where you can find all of the films that we've discussed to date. And Janetta will be back once again for another episode of Reels for Wheels. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for another episode of the TriDoc podcast. I hope that you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. As always, links to the medical references as well as to everything else discussed on the show can be found in the show notes at www.tridocpodcast.podbean.com. If you're interested in coaching services, please visit www.tridoccoaching.com, where you could find a lot of information about me and the services that I provide. The music heard at the beginning and the end of the show is Radio by Empty Hours and is used with permission. This song and many others like it can be found at www.reverbnation.com, where I hope that you will visit and give small, independent bands a chance. On the next episode of the TriDoc podcast, I'll continue my series into some of the issues raised by the Netflix documentary The Game Changers. For the 6th episode in the series, I will be joined by an environmental engineer and a co-author of a study for the Pew Charitable Trusts on the environmental impacts of industrial farming. Dr. Rolf Halden is a professor at Arizona State University and extremely well positioned to comment on what the film gets right and wrong about meat production and the health of our planet. I will also have a medical question to answer and another episode of Reels for Wheels. Until then, train hard, train healthy.